Now, just going into, you got the back channel going, you got the negotiations agreed to start having discussions around the framework agreement. Were there any sort of, and I know these things are technical as we spoke before, but still they are, and certainly in my own experience, when you're asked to help in a process, I'm not just there to technically do things, I'm also thinking, my principle is that the essence of what I'm doing is to try and find a resolution to the said conflict. It's not just about engaging. It's not, as you said, just talking about peace. There are overriding principles of what is our end game? What do we envision at the end? What are we fighting for? What was driving the government of Colombia at that time? President Santos, yourselves. What was the guiding principle around entering the negotiations?
Colombia is a very interesting case because it doesn't quite match, again, the standard theory of the mutually hurting stalemate, in the sense that politically, President Santos, when he was elected in 2010, was under no political obligation or pressure to start negotiations. Yeah. There had been a successful security campaign against FARC, led by his predecessor, President Uribe, and in many ways he was expected to continue doing just the same, and that was that. So the most expedient thing to do politically was just to do more of the same. But if you're a responsible president, then in the end, your responsibility is to preserve life. Yeah. And if you see that there's a chance of bringing this to an end in a reasonable way, with a reasonable chance of success, and without imperiling the progress you may have made in terms of security, then it's no question the right thing to do. And I think that's what President Santos thought. Very early, by the way, because all these efforts got going almost immediately as he became president. Okay. And as for myself, I actually thought, because when President Santos was minister, I was one of his deputy ministers, and I actually, as Deputy Minister of Defense, thought myself about 2 years earlier, and by the middle of 2008, I actually thought that, in a sense, the war was over, but we didn't know how to end it, in the sense that we had made enough progress to signal to the FARC that their strategy had been defeated, that their plan had been defeated, that there was no way they were going to take power, and that they were losing more and more ground, and that it was probably the right time to wrap the whole thing up. But it is, again, one thing to have favorable circumstances, it's another thing to actually structure a process that brings things to a close, and that's the challenge we had.
Listening to you now as well, Sergio, with the whiteboards and the discussion, it sounds as if you actually had quite a good rapport with the FARC. Is this how it worked? And I ask the question because in many cases, particularly the government, is very condescending towards the other groups, and it becomes almost antagonistic, and it's harder to get this working together, the sense that I get from you now.
It's perhaps not a very interesting, possibly rather boring way of presenting things, but we try to be very professional. So we were correct, cordial in our dealings, but not too close. And we were kind of businesslike. This is what we're here to do. We're trying to do this, get this agreement. At the same time, the war was raging. Yeah. I was asked about that yesterday in Uppsala, and it did happen that we would arrive at one of his rounds of secret talks in Havana. We would go back and forth. The FARC would stay there all the time. And the FARC would have ambushed. Once they ambushed in a province next to Venezuela, Arauca, they ambushed some like 17 of our soldiers. But we didn't say anything because the rule was, one thing is the battlefield, another thing is the negotiation table. We're here to look at the future and to solve the problem. This rule, by the way, was critical to avoid the kind of game of recriminations and whatever. And then a few weeks later, we go back, and we had bombed them and killed over 20, mostly commanders, who were people who were under my counterpart. I was leading the government's delegation. My counterpart was the commander of FARC Eastern Bloc, which was the largest kind of military arm of FARC. And we didn't say anything. And for him, it was very tough. But we were there to kind of solve this. And that was a little bit the atmosphere we created. And it has to be said also that because you're not under the limelight, you don't have the pressure of the public and the media, then you can have a freer conversation. This is why I think confidentiality is so important, at least for those first stages, to kind of sound each side out and to jointly build a basic structure. And because I think that if we had done this if it all been public, then it's very unlikely that the FARC would have agreed to some of the things they agreed to with us, because they would have been worrying about their own people. Now, there are limits to how far you can go with this. If you're a liberal democracy, because you have to start informing the public at some stage. You have to make sure you have mechanisms to make the process as inclusive as it is possible. But that is the beauty of phasing things out. So you do talks about talks, you create a structure, and then you tell the world, we have this structure, we're now going to do this. We can establish the mechanisms for participation. We can inform the public of what we're doing. We still keep the content of the talks confidential. But we let the world know what's going on. That's what we did anyway.
Now you have this framework agreement, the general agreement that you've come to. And when I look at it, I will say it is very much more structured. You can see it is well thought through. When I read it the first time, I don't know how many years ago it was, and I read it 10 years ago maybe, it's very structured compared to other previous framework agreements. And take Northern Ireland, for example, wasn't exactly a framework, but it did serve a function. Or even South Africa before that, it served a function in the heads of states, that agreement as well, or Camp David. So it was really well thought through, structured, and you come up with a very good agreement. It is almost, as you say, a final agreement that just needs to be fleshed out. So that was perfect. You have this. Now you need to communicate this. You need to get the buy-in of the people, as you said, the public of this. How do you do this? Was there, when you announced, when President Santos announced this agreement, was there celebrations in the streets in Bogota, Medellin, Cali?
Yes, so let's talk a little bit about this, because this is an incredibly important thing to understand, and that is that negotiating in secret, confidential talks and negotiations that are public, these are completely different planets. You're in a different solar system, actually. Because once the talks are public, the issue is not only talking to the other side, the issue is informing the public behind you about what's going on and guaranteeing, if you think you're doing the right thing, that you have support. And by the way, this is actually something, this is one of those, I call them kind of strategic situations, going back to the idea of lessons learned. This is the kind of thing that can be guaranteed happens anywhere. Once things move. For example, the failed negotiations that happened in Spain, which are not very well known, but were interesting between 2004 and 6-7, between the Zapatero government and people associated with Batasuna, who had links to ETA, and then to ETA itself, were very secret. But then the moment this whole thing was known, almost blew up. Apart from the fact that literally, and this is not a joke, but a very sad thing, that the ETA blew the whole thing up by putting a bomb. But it is a very different thing. So you have to really prepare for this. And this is, again, the kind of thing that you know is coming, but the reality is overwhelming. In our case, remember that we already had many failures at peace negotiations. So there was a great deal of skepticism. There was a great deal of animosity towards the FARC. For, the FARC and ELN had launched the sort of possibly the largest campaigns of kidnapping anywhere in the world, and so there was a great deal of resentment, and not just for the kidnapping. But on the whole, people were, I would say, through the first years of the negotiations, there were, at least the formal polls we had, were very supportive.
Okay.
And not hugely, but mostly, I would say. We certainly had a majority of Colombians who said they supported the negotiations. But then we had two problems. One was that they took very long, and so people started getting tired of this. Imagine that 4 years of non-stop negotiations is a long time. And secondly, former President Uribe decided to launch this vicious campaign against the negotiations and mobilize politically all the hard right and the right of Colombia against the negotiations. And this was very difficult, very, very difficult, because it was a great political challenge. And the lesson to take away there, it is not the first time that it has happened. No. Again, I mentioned a moment ago the classic case of Benjamin Netanyahu and Likud opposing the Oslo process and actually beating Paris in the 96 elections and putting a brake on that process, which is quite similar to what happened in Colombia in 2018, actually. And again, if we go back to how things work in the real world, you cannot just simply talk about peace negotiations, you need to talk about politics. Because this all happens, especially in a democracy. I always say, in a democracy, peace, if you have a conflict in a democracy, which is rare but not so unusual, this is what happens in Northern Ireland, this is what happens in Israel, Colombia, Palestine, that's what happened in Colombia. What the people, some academics in Belfast call conflicted democracies. Well, inevitably, this will be at the heart of the politics. This will be what a lot of the politics is about. This is going to determine political identities. So you actually have to work very hard at that, and I think that's probably something that we could have done better, including the president. I think a better job could have been done of building a broader coalition. There was a coalition. The president did have a broad coalition in support in Congress, but not necessarily in the general public. And this is something that you really need to work on a lot. And we were so immersed in these negotiations because they were so tough that even though we did do things, and because we would be mostly in Havana, but we would go back to Colombia every 2 weeks roughly, we probably in retrospect should have done much more to keep people engaged.
Coming to the international role, you didn't have a mediator. You can tell us why, very briefly. But you had guarantors that followed the process from the beginning. I'm talking specifically of Cuba, Norway, Chile, Venezuela. What were their roles? Were they helpful? Were they critical? Or were they just a nice add-on?
So we had. The first thing I will say is that we thought through very carefully what we wanted from the international community, because we had a very bad precedent of previous negotiations, which in Colombia are known as the Caguán, because they happened in this very large area of Colombia. The Colombian government crazily demilitarized an area which is literally the size of Switzerland to have the talks in. And this became a kind of circus. People would just turn up and you had all kinds of countries, and there was no no obvious logic. Now, of course, everyone wants to help, and one assumes is working in good faith. But at the same time, if you invite all these countries to support you, then what ends up happening is that everyone will want to play a role and do something. Look at, again, which Ulrich, what happened in Doha, and the kind of constant elbowing between the various countries that were there and the Qatari hosts, and everyone trying to sort of be the ones who would be let in the room and so forth, and how counterproductive that was in an already almost impossible negotiation, as we were discussing a moment ago. So we didn't want to go down that road, and so we went for what I call a kind of needs-based international support, which was, we'll just ask for what, strictly speaking, we need. And at the beginning, all we needed was one place, which was not in Colombia, to do the talks in, which was Cuba, and we needed to have another country to give us kind of technical support, and better to have two than one at the start. So that was Cuba and Norway. And what we developed was, interestingly, we also told them what we wanted from them. We set the rules, which was, we called them garantes in Spanish, guarantors, which it's an odd word in English, but that's what they did. They were the third parties who were in a way guaranteeing what was happening. What does that mean? Well, it can mean something as simple but as important as you're in the middle of a negotiation. For example, especially in the second, much longer phase, where you're negotiating all these really complex things, and you finish a negotiation cycle and you haven't finished the agreement because they're complex. So, okay, what happens with the text as it is? Who keeps that? You don't want to get into all kinds of fighting about, okay, no, the text is this one, the one I kept it. So what do? You give it to the garantes. They are protecting it. You see? That's a very simple example, but that was the spirit.
But an important example.
See, so the rule we came up with was, the main rule we came up with was, you can, and in fact you should be in the room, and they were almost always in the room, but you cannot participate in the talks. We don't want any mediation, and your job is not to write the agreement. You can just be there. That in itself already had a very important effect of creating a sort of solemnity and seriousness and calm to the proceedings. That's important, especially if you're negotiating directly. And as you just mentioned, we didn't want to have a mediator. That was the other. It's not so common not to have a mediator. No. And I always take my hat off to the FARC, because writing a complex agreement like this is a difficult thing. And we were a government, educated people with lots of support. The FARC have been fighting for 50 years. And yet they did a good job of it, and they also got some advisors. So the rule was, okay, you guarantors, you can be there, you don't intervene, but outside of the negotiating table, at certain moments, if required, you can facilitate. So when we had the big crisis that I mentioned about demobilization and disarmament, they started kind of pending back and forth. When I said, we're not continuing, we're leaving, go back to Colombia, then they started shuttling, and that had to happen a few times. Not so often, but when it happened, there were really serious things. And in one occasion, so for example, on this first one, the role of the Norwegians and of Dagny Lander, who was a Norwegian diplomat who was with us all the time, who did really a fantastic job, really, really competent professional diplomat, was critical in helping us, supporting us in the design of a formula to get us out of this cul-de-sac.
The world, as you know, is changing and has changed. At the time of the Colombia agreements or negotiations, I'm not saying geopolitics didn't exist. It did always, but it becomes more profound at that point, where the unipolar world is now being challenged, contested by a number of actors. So when it comes to conflicts, we find that the conflict is not just between two parties or a government and parties within its state. it becomes both intra and or internationalized as well to some extent. And I give you the cases of Yemen, for example, or Syria, where it's not just up to the Yemenis or the Syrians to make a decision here. There are powers that are major powers that are involved that actually take decisions. Or we can talk about Afghanistan, a similar case, Georgia, Ukraine today. So the world is again bringing a new challenge. How, in your view, how would you advise people to look at structuring negotiations or peace agreements with these challenges? Now, I'm not saying that Colombia didn't have them. You did have, of course, these challenges, but not to the extent, I think, that Syria or Afghanistan had.
So let me say two things. First, that you are right. The geopolitical environment matters hugely. And there are certain moments in history when things are possible and certain others when they are not, which is one of the reasons why, as always in the real world, when an opportunity presents itself, we really have to snatch it immediately before it flies away. That particular moment in history, the years 2011-12, were peculiar because there was a coincidence of interests between the Colombian government wanting to wrap up the conflict with the FARC and the US wanting to improve the nature of its relations with Cuba. And by the way, this was not entirely coincidental. We knew this was going on. And President Santos offered at one stage, at the beginning of those contacts, that Colombia could be a place for them to take place. They ended up actually happening in Canada. And so it was a moment where it was truly a moment, as President Santos himself said in a speech in the Summit of the Americas in Cartagena in May of 2012, it was a moment of building bridges, where even if you had very different systems and politics and regimes, as was evidently the case between Cuba and Colombia, or Venezuela and Colombia, you could try and find ways of working together towards shared interests in a positive way. And much more so in the case of the US, which was, the Americans were very supportive of these negotiations and very respectful of what we were doing, and only much later on sent a brilliant special envoy, Bernie Aronson, who had been already the Assistant Secretary of the Western Hemisphere during the Salvador negotiations, could not be more experienced. But anyway, so you had a very positive moment. This could not have been done 6 years later under Trump. It just couldn't have been possible. In fact, when we had to do this, we had to renegotiate part of the agreement after we lost a referendum by 0.3%. I remember doing this in a safe house in Havana. It was in the evening, a television was on, and suddenly the news, Trump has won. I thought, God, this is the last thing we need. And in effect, made everything much, much more difficult. Everything became much more tense. Under Trump, what we did under Obama would not have been possible. The second thing I will say is the importance of starting by working with the region and with your neighbors, which is what President Santos did. Kind of aligning your neighbors around the idea of the peace process. I always say, if you have a major conflict in your territory, if you have an insurgency, inevitably you're going to have problems with your neighbors, because the insurgency is always going to try and find sanctuary in the neighboring countries, who are willingly or unwillingly going to allow them to be there. In some cases, like Venezuela, only too willingly, or Pakistan. So bringing them in is a key part of creating the right conditions. And this is something that President Santos did from the very beginning of his term. Literally 3 days after he took office, he invited Chavez to a very historic place, the house where Simon Bolivar died, in Santa Marta near the coast, the Caribbean coast, and had a chat with Chavez and said, "Look, what are we going to do? We have to behave like adults. We're neighbors." And started changing that relation. His foreign minister, who had been ambassador in Venezuela, Maria Angela Holguín, worked very hard at this. I was myself sent as secret envoy to talk to Chavez about what we were planning. So I did this a few times,
So he was in the loop.
and kind of bring them in, and he actually was a key part of pushing the FARC into the negotiations, and literally moved from being part of the problem to being part of the solution. And at a smaller scale, but something similar was done with Correa in Ecuador. And then you had Cuba, and then we had the region, and kind of expanding concentric circles, if you like, of support. If you contrast that with Afghanistan, only at the very end you saw Khalilzad running around the region, the Americans trying to align all these countries that were not their friends, like Russia and China, or Iran. The UN naming very late in the game as a special envoy Jean Arnaud, who'd been in Colombia to deal with the region, and he obviously very quickly noticed that it was hopeless and gave up. But this is something that should have happened long before, not sort of months, if not weeks before Kabul was about to fall. So this is really a critical piece, building this international envelope of support at the start.
Maybe lastly, we'll just talk about, again, back to strategic communications. We see today's world, and we're talking beyond Colombia now, just the world itself. We're very divided societies. People are almost tribal in their positioning. I'm on this side and I'm on that side, and they're not willing to be reasonable in any discussion, let alone look at compromise. And of course, social media plays a role in this, and the rapid deployment now of AI will also add to this here. I'm not suggesting for one second that the media before was best and there was no propaganda or no sides taken. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it was one way that the media was working. It is a separate way that it's working now. There's less of a common narrative. There's more of individuals, more of blocks that have been created. We have to learn how to work with this here. We have to learn how to deal with it. What would be your advice on this here? How did you manage it? I know, again, we take Colombia as a case where these things were just emerging at the time. The social media, coming into the process. It had some impact in terms of the final agreement, but not as it is today. What would be your advice in terms of dealing with these within a peace process?
Well, you're right, evidently, that trying to run hard, demanding, challenging, sometimes controversial peace negotiations in a highly polarized environment politically is a very difficult thing to do. And the widespread use of social media now makes all of this very, very difficult. People are constantly tweeting and not just tweeting about the negotiations, but generally the kind of discussion you get in the world of Twitter is not the kind of discussion you want for around a peace process. So you have to think creatively, and something that really worked for us was, I mentioned before, and I think we will be talking about this later on, around the issue of inclusion, was to organize these really very large conferences we organized with the support of the UN, and I mentioned before the largest university in Colombia, the Universidad Nacional, to get proposals to go to the negotiating table. And these were very large. They had always more than 1,000 people from all over the country. They were very costly to organize because you had to fly people in, They're almost always, not always, but mostly happened in Bogota. Now, the reason I mention this is the following. My point is not so much now about inclusion, but about the fact that the way these conferences were designed, which was you had to have a wide variety of actors around the subject. For example, the first one was on land issues and rural development. And you had very kind of tough, sometimes radical organizations linked to the world of small farmers and campesinos. And you had other organizations that represented the interests of the large landowners and were very conservative. But because of the way this conference was organized and the way that it gave everyone voice, this is to me a key concept here. Give people voice and make sure that this voice is acknowledged and respected, then the whole process was really very civilized in the way that the discussion unfolded. So I think the ways of doing this, of structuring discussions in a way that if people see they're being taken seriously, they're being acknowledged, they have voice, but they also have to listen to the other side, and all of this is going to feed into a larger purpose. It's not impossible to do it. I think we're an example.
Sergio, we've spoken for quite a while now. It's been fascinating discussion. Thanks, Sergio.
Thank you very much.
Really appreciate it.